So I want to go into something that's of more personal interest to me since I'm the host today. Maurice Cheng. So of course I know you are very, very well depth in read, really read well about TSMC. But about Maurice Cheng, are you able to talk a little bit about his background, a bit about his roots and how he started TSMC? Because I think that's a pretty cool story for the listeners.
I think I'll just try to recall it from memory.
Sure.
So Maurice Cheng actually was already in the whole semiconductor space.
Yeah, he's born and bred in the actual industry itself, right?
Yeah, so I think he was in IBM or Texas. I'm not too sure, but he's in one of the big US companies before, and he realized that all these chip makers, right, they have a lot of trouble to make very small chips because back then, in those days when Moore's law started getting more and more popular, he realized that these companies cannot actually go into very granular level. They're not able to actually go deep into making very, very small chips. And the reason why is because back in those days, right, you have all these companies which makes both design and manufacture both their technology, and they also make all these chips. And he realized that this is not the way to go because for him as an expert, he saw what other people did not see. And that is purely making chips such that, he can actually allocate all his time, his effort, and his money to just build that chips. But back in the 80s and the 90s, there wasn't really anyone doing it.
Okay.
So he decided that, hey, okay, I'm going to stop what I'm doing. I think he was like 50, in his 50s or 60s.
Yeah.
And he decided to just, quit and go back to Taiwan to set up his plant because that was where his roots from.
Yes.
And he set up the plant, and that's where TSMC was. From my recollection, right, I think when they got started in 1987, they only make like 2 losses in the entire, time when they are around. From 1987 till today, they only had 2 losses.
Yeah.
And it shows how successful Maurice Cheng is. And what I really love about him is not so much about him bringing his technical expertise, right? Like what you mentioned earlier, Max, he's already well into his 70s or 80s, I think.
Yes, exactly. This guy's a badass.
For someone who is willing to continue in his 70s or 80s, really shows that he has a lot of passion for chips. And that was what I got. And it was really inspiring for me because me as an analyst, starting off my career as an analyst, when I talked to, managers and CEOs, right?
Yeah.
What really stood out for me was managers or founders who had that passion to run businesses. And you can tell, even though at a certain age, they are still running the business, they're still really pretty much involved in the business. And Maurice Cheng strikes out to me as one of those people.
Yeah, so I think in investing, we call it like soul in the game, which is a phrase for founders like this, where it's really not just about the money. And this guy, he's really in his retirement age already, and he could really just go enjoy life and then like play golf forever. And then you start a freaking company at 60.
Right.
When most people are about to, to wind down their final life stage. Yeah.
I mean, who wants to be walking into an office and then still talking about chips in their 70s when they could just be playing with their grandkids or playing golf somewhere, right?
And how old is he today roughly? Are you aware? Just curious.
I don't know. I think he's roughly about 70s or I don't know, in his 70s or 80s. I mean, this is an age where you probably don't even want to step
No, I
into
don't think he's
office,
that young because he started it when he was like close to 60 or something, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so and it's 1980 something, right? You were mentioning.
Yeah,
so it's probably like close to 80s, maybe close to 90s. Okay,
I don't know. There's so much energy.
Just curious. Okay, thanks for sharing. Yeah, so I just wanted the listeners to understand about this guy's background because that's what I saw in kind of like a short YouTube clip about this guy's background. Okay, so let's go in a bit to the competitive landscape right now. So I think first of all, I want to talk about something that's very interesting as of now. Nancy's trip to the right, yeah. So and of course, this whole thing is tied into one company that rules them all.
Yeah, you can't talk about
TSMC.
Yeah, you can't talk about politics. You can't talk about TSMC without talking about politics.
So I can share with the listeners. Honestly, I wanted to steer this podcast as much as I can away from politics because I know nothing about it and I really don't know who's watching behind that screen there. But let's just go there. So can you share maybe just a quick 5-minute background about where TSMC is today in the political backdrop and why is it so damn influential, right? The CHIPS Act and all these trips overseas and everything, and then China giving a warning that you better not set foot, but Nancy still goes in. Yeah. So what's the whole thing about?
Yeah. So the thing about TSMC is that there's always a struggle there as an investor. So just to put it out as a disclaimer, I own TSMC shares, and I always struggle myself, right? Because this is one of the few companies where if I read the annual reports of TSMC, I have no choice but to also understand what goes behind the geopolitical issues of this manufacturing company. The reason is actually very simple because if you see TSMC, right, a lot of what they produce today actually is being sold to the US.
Yes.
And like we've mentioned earlier, right, it's very difficult for US companies like Intel to actually compete with TSMC. So they are highly dependent on TSMC's technology. But what they're afraid here is that China, because Taiwan is considered part of the greater China, right? What happened is that the US is obviously afraid that China can say, look, I'm just going to physically condone the entire Taiwanese island, and I'm just going to stop, exports of TSMC products to your country. And that's going to kill a lot of businesses there. Right? So we're not just talking about Apple or Intel, we're talking about companies like Qualcomm, Broadcom, other big semiconductor players in the US. And as a result of this, there's always that fear over there. At one point, right, I remembered, I think some time back, the US was encouraging TSMC to actually build their plants in the US because they also want to physically have all these chip makers, TSMC chips, being produced in the US.
I believe that's what's happening, right? I think TSMC is building like a local US presence in the US.
Yeah, but this is still on the cards right now. There's really nothing certain. Like, even if they do, I don't think that it will be a huge production because at the end of the day, most of the production still falls in Taiwan itself. And I'm not surprised that TSMC would also have production facilities in China because of the cost. So that's really the struggle, between US, China, Taiwan, and TSMC. And you can't really get away with it because if you look at where the share price is, a lot of why the shares have actually fallen is really because of all these geopolitical tensions, just geopolitical issues. I mean, if you see, like what you said, Nancy Pelosi, when she visited Taiwan, you can see how jittery the market was. You can see how TSMC, traded, right? Everyone was scared. And, there was a huge sell-off. I believe TSMC fell from $100 over its ADR. Now it's about $60 over, right? And it's always that fear which is baked into the stock price itself. So politics is definitely something which, if you are an investor of TSMC, is something which you definitely want to pay attention to because the things which TSMC, on one hand, their home ground is in Greater China, but on the other hand, they sell all over the world. And you can see, the conflict between US and China right now.
So you come to the domain.
It is a very unique situation, Max. I always think, what happens if really a full-blown war comes out.
There are a lot of black swan possibilities down here, right?
Correct. Or what if US and China really decides to say, I'm not going to sell stuff to you, you are not going to sell stuff to me, which is what's happening right now, right? You can see US is actually stopping China from importing or buying technology, chip technology from the US. That's why, you have other stocks like NVIDIA, AMD, they're all down because NVIDIA also sells their own products, their own chips to China. And what you're seeing now is that there's a cut between China and US itself. And TSMC, falls right in the middle of this whole conflict.
Okay, I'm going to put you a little bit on the spot because I have a question that I love, but please feel free to just share as much as you can. Like, what is maybe one or two black swans that you foresee for TSMC, as in negative black swans that could happen due to them being at the center of all this geopolitical tension?
I think one big risk is when China really physically decides to just say, no, TSMC, you're not allowed to actually sell things overseas.
And
that's
so
what's going to kill.
Strong-arm it.
So they're just going to strong-arm it. But I think China is smart enough not to actually play that game because they know that at the end of the day, no matter what the US government decides to do, no matter what the Biden administration decides to do, China sort of have that knowledge that Taiwan, because they physically, geographically, Taiwan is still part of China. They know that at any time, they can just take TSMC under their arms, right? And like just what they did, in history. So I don't think that would happen. If they do, I mean, it could cause a huge crisis. But at this point, I don't think so. And largely because in today's world, right, everything is so economically interrelated, right? You can say that I'm not going to sell you chips here, but don't forget that China also needs chip technology in the US, right? If they decide to say, I'm going to stop production for TSMC, think about what's going to happen to the sale of your Apple phones, your Samsung phones, which are going to be sold in China. Think about the technology which China can potentially get in the US. I'm not just talking about nano chips, right? We are also talking about other parts of the value chain which we have mentioned. And all this, US is still the leading edge of technology in some of this semiconductor space, and China needs that as well.
Okay, fantastic. I love it. So based off this, let's go a little bit into the economic modes of TSMC. So what kind of modes does TSMC have? So of course, I think one of the very obvious ones we have already mentioned is really just the innovation due to the structural DNA of the company. Any other advantages, competitive alpha edge that they have over the competition be other than this?
Yeah, I think really what lies behind their monopoly here, I mean, it's not just about the technology, but it's also the willingness and the ability to just focus on just one thing. I think that's something which a lot of companies, they tend to struggle with. I mean, you're an investor yourself, Max. You have seen a lot of companies, they try to focus on one product, but sometimes, they just can't compete with other people.
Yeah.
TSMC have the edge of they can focus on just one product. They can do it really, really well. No one else can actually touch them. And I think that's really a huge edge. That's something where you don't really get to see very often. Really, the byproduct of that is the ability to produce, what I call capital efficiency, right? You put in $1 and you can generate, tons and tons of dollar in the future. Very few companies can do it. TSMC is just one of them, being able to actually use this power of the one thing which they do, and they do it really, really well. So I think that's a competitive advantage in itself.
But this one thing can also bite them out, right? This one thing, because of course that one thing is serving them well right now, but you could also bite them in the butt when that one thing no longer works, right? Because everything is down to that one thing.
Yeah.
So what is in your opinion, I'm sure you've considered that as well, how will you talk about this in this case if it's just one thing stops working?
Yeah, I mean, if I put on my investors thinking cap right now, right, and if I own a portfolio, I wouldn't put all my money into TSMC,
Okay.
of course. But of course, I will always diversify it in a basket of stocks. And that sort of helps to hedge out or protect my downside. If, let's say, like what you said, a black swan comes in, or let's say the power of one doesn't work anymore.
So you're talking about it from a more investor allocation point of view, than what I get. But from a company point of view, are they doing anything in this case, like to move beyond that foundry level? Or is really just still hardcore, just foundry level?
I think there's also a struggle with all business owners because, as business owners, you also want to ask yourself, like, hey, should I continue to actually double down on what I'm doing? Because since I'm doing very well.
Are they moving beyond their role in the supply chain?
No. So based on the latest quarter results, which they talk about, I think they are still going to focus on making very, very granular sized chips, going from 2 nanometer, maybe even smaller than that. I think what they are sort of struggling right now, or the problem which they have for TSMC, is really like the whole macro point, like the whole macro environment. You're talking about supply chain and oversupply of chips, for example. I think that's something which they are also concerned, because if you see this month, a lot of tech companies, a lot of the semiconductor companies, when they release results, a lot of them, they have that fear that people are just not buying electronic products due to the recessionary fears. And don't forget, Max, semiconductor is a very cyclical industry. So let us not forget about that.
Fair enough.
Yeah, because that's something which is inherent in the industry itself. And I think that's what TSMC struggles with. So I don't think they are purposefully trying to diversify away. I think what they're trying to do is trying to manage whether they can actually meet with the demands, which happened during the pandemic, and also be able to overcome, the potential huge oversupply issue which they might face, or many chip makers might face, in the future.
Okay, understood.